So in today's video, I'd like to look at a subject I was actually hoping I could avoid. It is a subject which has caused a great deal of division in the church over the years. In fact, there have been only a few great schisms in the church. First of all, there was the split between the Roman and the Greek church. Then there was the great split between the Roman church and the Protestant church. And finally, this great schism, this great separation in mindset within the Protestant church. It is known as the Covenant versus the Dispensational Theology. And it is a way of looking at the Bible. There are two ways that we could view the Bible. There are two ways that we could interpret the Bible. So why is this so important that we understand this and we figure out what is the correct way to divide the Bible? Well, first of all, it is important that we are consistent in the way that we interpret the Bible. We have to go through the entirety of the scriptures with a framework, with a system that we can work around. Otherwise, we run into the dangers of making the Bible say whatever we want it to say, not what it actually says. Secondly, the decisions we make in terms of interpreting the Bible will alter the way that we view our role as Christians on the earth, quite dramatically so. Thirdly, it will change the way we view ourselves as a church, as a group of Christians. It will alter the way that we view the future, not just of the church, but of the world as a whole. And finally, it will alter the way that we view other people. So it's important that we really get to grips with this and really understand what we're talking about. So to start off with, I'd like to give you a quick overview of what the two different sides say. First of all, covenantal theology. Covenant simply means a promise made to a group of people. In scriptural terms, it is normally a promise between God and another. And we can see countless examples of covenants in the Bible. We could see the Abrahamic covenant, the land covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the Davidic covenant, and of course the new covenant. However, covenantal theory is not looking at those covenants. Covenantal theory says that those covenants are part of a larger singular covenant. Covenantal theory would suggest that there are three covenants. Now, these are not covenants, these are not promises explicitly stated in the Bible, but they would suggest that they are implicit in the Bible. The first of these three covenants is the covenant of redemption. And this is a covenant made between the three persons of the Godhead in eternity. It said that God required somebody to be a salvation bringer, and Christ agreed to be that salvation bringer on the earth. Secondly, there was the covenant of works. And this is the time before the fall of Adam. This is the time between creation and Adam's fall in the garden. Covenantal theory suggests this is an implied promise between God and Adam. It says that if Adam were to do God's will, were to not sin, he would live forever. Finally, there is the covenant of grace. And this is the means of salvation throughout all of human history. That if you have faith, grace will be given to you by God. And you might say, well, that sounds all very good. That sounds all very right. I don't see any problem with that. And you might not. And there might not be any problems with that mindset. And so we must look at now the second way of viewing the Bible, and that is what we call dispensational theology. A dispensation simply means a period of time. Now, there are a number of different dispensations that have been proposed by people, but the most commonly held position is that there are 7. Firstly, there is the dispensation of innocence, or the age of innocence. And that is the time where Adam was living in the garden. This was a time when God revealed himself to Adam in a very personal way. He came down in the cool of the evening and walked with Adam and talked with him. But of course, we know that at the fall, that ended and Adam was cast from the garden. And so we move into a second dispensation known as the dispensation of conscience. And this is when man was given a conscience that he might know the difference between good and evil. He would know what was good and he would know what was evil simply by listening to the conscience within him. But of course, we know that man still failed, man still sinned. And so God gave human beings an additional help. He gave them human government. And this is the time from Noah onwards. After the Great Flood, humanity is told that it must govern itself. Before the flood, man did whatever he saw right in his own eyes. Man is told that he must rule over other men. Next comes the dispensation of promise. And this is where Abraham comes in. He's given a promise by God. God reveals himself to Abraham and starts instructing him in the way he should behave. Next comes the dispensation of law. And this is when God gives his law to Moses at Mount Sinai. He's told how people should live. He's given clearer and greater instructions, not just on how people should live within themselves, within their own homes, but also how the nation of Israel should conduct itself. Here we have the 10 Commandments plus all the Mosaic law. Then we have the dispensation of grace, and that is the time from the cross until what we refer to as the rapture of the church, or the snatching away of the church, and we'll discuss that more in a little bit. The final dispensation is the millennial kingdom, or the millennial reign of Christ. It's a 1,000-year period in which Christ rules upon the earth with perfect justice. Why does this matter? Well, it comes down to one key point. The key point that covenantal and dispensational theologians will disagree on. And that is, how do the church and Israel relate to one another? Covenantal theology says that the church and Israel are one thing. That the church is simply the new name given to true Israel. Covenantal theology says that the church began with Abraham in Genesis 12 and continues to this day. Dispensational theology says that the church began in Acts 2 on the day of Pentecost, and that the church and Israel are two distinct and separate things. There are a small group of theologians who would say that the church began with the birth of Christ, but that would cause errors when we read through the Bible. It causes confliction. The covenantal view of the church and Israel being one thing is often referred to as replacement theory or replacement theology. Many covenantal theologians would disagree with that name. They'd say it's more a continuation theory or continuation theology. Replacement or continuation theology suggests that there is no 70th week as we see described in Daniel chapter 9. It says that there is no millennial reign as described within the Bible. It has all the blessings promised to Israel being given to the church, but it conveniently forgets about the responsibilities that Israel had. One of the biggest problems with the church in Israel being the one thing is that it tends to lead to anti-Semitic views. We must ask ourselves, what verses support the covenantal position that church and Israel are one thing? And there are some verses that you might turn to. You could turn to Matthew chapter 21, starting at verse 43. Jesus talks there about the kingdom being given to the Gentiles, or being given to Gentiles. We could also look in Galatians in chapter 6. It talks about the Israel of God in reference potentially to the church. Probably one of the most commonly used supporting passages is Galatians chapter 3, where it speaks about Abraham's seed. From these three passages, should we infer then that the church and Israel are one? Well, I tend to think not, for a number of very good reasons. We will look at these passages that are given in support of the church and Israel being one, and we will maybe see that there are some flaws in that understanding of those verses. Matthew chapter 21 says the kingdom will be given to the Gentiles, but just a few chapters later in Matthew 23, Christ talks about the Jews returning to him. It talks about the changing mind of the Jewish people. In Galatians, there's a number of good reasons why the Israel of God does not refer to the church. There are grammatical reasons and there are usage reasons why that would not be the correct interpretation of those verses. In Galatians chapter 3, we can see that, yes, the Jews were of the line of Abraham, but Abraham had other descendants, other seed, Gentiles, through Ishmael. He was the natural father both of the Jews and of the Ishmaelites. Ishmael was Abraham's seed, but he was not Jewish. He was not part of Israel. Further explanation of this could be seen in Romans in chapter 4. But there are further verses that would indicate that the church is not Israel and did not begin in Genesis chapter 12. First of all, we can look at Matthew chapter 16, when Christ says, "I will build my church." That is future tense. He did not say, "I have been building and I will continue to build my church upon this rock," but rather, "I will, future, build my church," which would refute both the church beginning in Genesis and the church beginning with Christ's birth. Future tense in Matthew. I would suggest that the church begins in Acts, at the day of Pentecost. Were we to read 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 13, it would tell us that the church was baptized by Spirit into one body. There was no baptism in Genesis. The first time we have any expression of baptism in the Bible is in the Gospels, where we have John's baptism, which is different from Christian baptism, as we will maybe discuss in a future video. In Acts chapter 11, Peter speaks of the beginning at Pentecost. And it's quite obvious from the reading of that he's referring to the beginning of the church at Pentecost. So we can see the beginning of the church clearly taught from Scripture as being in Acts at Pentecost. But secondly, we can tell the church is not Israel by the fact that Scripture keeps them separate. We can look in 1 Corinthians in chapter 10, and we see there that it says the Jews, the Greeks, and the Church of God. Three distinct categories of peoples: the Jews, the Greeks, and the Church of God. In Isaiah 54, we see that Israel is described as the wife of God. But when we come to Revelation chapter 21, we see that the church is described as the bride of Christ. And we see in Revelation the marriage supper of the Lamb being recorded as a future event. So it cannot be that they are already the wife. So there's a subtle but very important separation here. Thirdly, there is the promise of a future for Israel separate from that future for the church. As we've already said in Matthew 23, we see that the Jews change their mind when it comes to their view of who Christ is, Christ as their Messiah. One of the key events that help us to separate Israel's future from the church's future is what we refer to as Jacob's trouble or the Great Tribulation. We can see this in Jeremiah 30 and Matthew chapter 24. The tribulation begins with the rapture of the church into heaven, the snatching away of the church into heaven, and finishes with the Battle of Armageddon, when Jerusalem is surrounded and about to be destroyed. In 1 Thessalonians 1, it talks about being delivered from the wrath to come. In 1 Thessalonians 5, it tells us that the church is not appointed to this wrath. In Revelation 19, along with other verses, we can see Christ's return to the earth to deliver Israel. This is different from Christ's return to the air to rapture the church, to snatch away the church from this appointed wrath. After this great tribulation and Christ returns to the earth, we have what is known as the millennial reign of Christ. Covenantal theology leaves no place for this, however, it is clearly taught. In Isaiah and in Luke, we see that Christ will rule for 1,000 years over the nation of Israel. But in Psalms, Daniel and Zechariah, we see that Christ will rule over the Gentiles for 1,000 years based in Jerusalem. We see from Acts chapter 3 that the beginning of the millennial reign is marked by a restoration of Israel. Why is it so important to keep Israel and the church separate? Well, first of all, there are promises made to Israel that are not for us, the church. And there are promises that are made to us that are not for Israel. We have a different role. Covenantal theology suggests that we ought to make this world entirely Christian. And if we must use force, we should use force. That'd be very different from the dispensational view of things, where the church and Israel is kept separate. We ought not to suggest that the entire world must become a Christian, but simply those who choose to be Christians ought to become Christians. We have to understand that there is a future for Israel, that we ought not to try to destroy Israel. Israel are still God's chosen people. And although He set them aside for a little while, He has not forsaken them. There were promises made that are not based on Israel's adherence to any certain work, but rather God simply showing His love to Israel. Covenantal versus dispensational theology is very important in understanding how the church operates day by day, what it is, what it should be, and how it should conduct itself. I think it's quite clear where I land. in this debate. I would say the Bible is perfectly clear that the church and Israel are two separate things. We ought not to conflate the two. And so all future videos I will be taking the position of dispensational separation of church and Israel. Hopefully it's been helpful. It is a huge subject. I have simply given you an overview. It is important though to note that just because somebody believes in covenantal theology does not mean they're not a Christian. We ought to be very careful not to treat those people who operate with a different theology from us as being enemies. We can agree to disagree. We do, however, agree on a great number of things. We agree on the Trinity. We agree on Christ as the Creator. We agree on the divinity of Christ. We agree that salvation is through grace alone, through faith alone. We can find common ground. And we ought to, each side, come together and find where we agree and politely discuss with an open mind where, and more importantly, why we disagree.